So we're going to talk about managing change in the religious education program tonight. As I said, we'll be here for about an hour. I'll do some talking and then we'll have some time for questions. Just want to take a moment to welcome you and just invite everybody to take a breath as we enter into a time of learning and reflection and thinking about these things which are important to us. So I'm happy that you have taken the time to be with us. So we're going to generally talk about change. Change is something that is all around us and completely inevitable. We're going to talk specifically about some of the ways that change may affect the children in the congregation and also how it affects the adults who may be engaged in the program. I'm going to share some strategies with you for managing change, talking about change, and hopefully avoiding conflict. And I'll lift up a couple of resources, a couple of really good resources that I think you may want to have for later. So I'll tell you, I've got a little bit of an allergy thing. It's a beautiful day. Everything's growing. The grass is green and the trees are popping. So I've got a little bit of an allergy reaction going on right now, but I'll get through. So change is all around us. Change is an inevitable part of our lives. And when we think about change in the religious education program, usually we're thinking about three particular kinds of change. One is change in people. So the people who are visible, the people who are either volunteering or professional staff, the people who are those voices and those faces that are part of the children's experience on a Sunday. The other piece of change that can be really important in the RE program is place, change of place. Children get connected to places, sometimes a little bit differently than adults. Children are in a very sensual phase of life, so they connect with the way things feel. They connect with smells, aromas, and they connect with the color of the room can become a really significant part of how they're connecting with their space. And the third thing that is important is program. So sometimes we have significant changes in our program, and children in particular are creatures of routine, and those things are really important. So people, place, program, any one of those things can create a little bit of a disruption in the force in our RE program. So that's what we want to think about strategies for. I just want to share with you. There's a great resource. It's an oldie but goodie book. It's Leading Change in the Congregation by Gil Rendle, and I'm actually not sure how old it is. 1998. So, in this book, Gil introduces this concept of the roller coaster of change. And I think it's a really significant and important concept for us to kind of, it creates a lens for us as we do the change work. So when we introduce a change, so there's this moment before a change is introduced where there's just a small group that may know. And so they are, they're leaders generally, and they may have some anxiety, but they also, as leaders, they also generally have some anticipation, a sense of anticipation. How's the congregation going to react? Where it depends on the change, but if it's a staffing change, how's the congregation going to feel if a longtime staff person is leaving? We've done a capital campaign. We're finally going to renovate space, but the RE classes have to be displaced for 6 months. How are people going to manage that? So leaders kind of have this time before the change is even introduced to the congregation, where they're kind of in feeling some anxiety, but also some excitement. And then a change gets announced. Now, depending on the magnitude of the change, it could be something that people is unexpected. It could be if you are in a congregation maybe where there's a sudden leaving of a staff person, someone has an illness, or there's a termination that happens. That can create shock waves of discomfort and anxiety in the congregation. If you have a sudden change in your space, something like a fire, and unfortunately, I'm in a congregation that's had that happen more than once, and so there's this shock. There's this moment where people really it's very unexpected, and so this roller coaster of change, we go through a variety of different responses. And some people, they skip right over and say, "Oh, good, that building was, we needed a new building anyway, so let's move forward." So, most people have this little process, and this process leads us down to the valley of despair. And it's like, wow, things will never be the same, and how are we going to get through this? And there's going to be so much more work for people. I'm sure you've kind of heard this if you've been a leader in a congregation for more than a week. These are the kinds of reactions that people sometimes have. But generally speaking, the tide turns. Well, people come to a decision point. When they get down to that valley of despair, they come to a decision point and they say, this is more anxiety, this is more change than I can bear. And so they leave the congregation, or they decide not to volunteer in the RE program, or they make some other shift that sort of takes them to a place where they can stay in that pain. They don't have to turn the corner. But most people are going to, there will be conversation, there will be information, they will see leaders modeling acceptance and enthusiasm and excitement about the change, and so others will begin that climb back up to that positive space. And this is just sort of a typical pattern that happens in most congregations. So, if you feel as though, okay, we're really in this sad place, maybe because a longtime staff person is leaving, or we're in this really shaky place because we've been through some kind of a conflict, most of us will make that turn back up. But what I think is really important, an important lens to bring into this, into your change process, is remembering that it's the roller coaster. So I'm a big roller coaster fan. I love roller coasters. And if you are a roller coaster enthusiast, you may know that the experience that you have in the front car is very different from the experience that the people in the back car have, or the people in the middle. So leaders, generally speaking, are sitting in the front car. So they're sort of in this wild free fall, and, their arms are up, and, but it happens, they come up out of it, and there are people in the congregation who are still on their way kind of down into that low point. And so sometimes as leaders, we make that turn, and our hearts are open, and we're ready to move on and accept the change. And there are others that are still processing and still working that through. So we need to be kind of sensitive to that as leaders. The other thing, just in terms kind of foundational theory, is this idea of the dolphin versus the whale. I'm a big beach fan. I love the Jersey Shore, and the dolphins are very often making their way down the shoreline, and they're very playful and they're very elegant, and they go up, they go down. There's this rhythm to the way the dolphins make their way down the shoreline. But what it's actually about is it's actually about their breath. They don't take in as much of a breath as some other creatures in this world. So they're coming up for breath. So there's this rhythm and this pattern that emerges. So the dolphin versus the whale. The whale is a much bigger creature, and the whale has a capacity to take a much bigger breath, to take in more that it needs. And then it submerges and it can go deep. It can go really deep. And then when it comes up, there's a huge splash and there's a huge sort of ripple that comes from a breaching whale. So the visual image is really different of this playful sort of rhythmic way that a dolphin makes their way versus this really big splash. So in terms of change, thinking about the change that you are trying to bring about, or the change that has parked itself on your doorstep, people feel better about that, about getting that change kind of in small bites, or to work through that change in a really measured and sort of rhythmic sort of way, as opposed to boom, this is it, everything's changing, splash, and we're all feeling that sense of drowning. So this is just sort of a metaphor that I like when I think about change, and I love dolphins. So I already sort of talked about, introduced some of the different things that can be changing in your religious education program, so that people can change. And sometimes, wow, that can be really traumatic. It can be a longtime staff person. It can be a longtime volunteer. And these things can be interrelated. We can change programs. We can decide that we're going to move to Tapestry of Faith after we've been doing another curriculum for 10 years, and we've had the same person doing that curriculum all these years. And so when we switch to something new, that person may feel out of water. They may feel that they're not needed anymore. So there's a lot of emotion that comes out around change. There's also a lot of competing priorities. So when we're making changes in the program, we sort of think that we want to think about the children first, but there are parents to consider. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a situation, maybe with a youth group or a coming of age, where you want to try something different, you want to experiment, and a parent maybe who's had a couple of older children, and a third kid is coming through, and they say, "Oh no, don't change anything. I know how this works. I know what has to be done. Please don't change anything now." So sometimes it's the parents that are resistant to change. Sometimes it's leaders, and sometimes children are the ones that resist the change. So everybody kind of comes in with a different goal, just like in any work that we do in the congregation. So we have to kind of keep those competing priorities in our mind as we work through change. And so again, sort of the dolphin versus the whale. Change is a process; it's not an event. And if you work it through as a process, it's gentler, and people have more time to get on the upswing of the roller coaster. So I want to talk specifically about children and how children may react to change. And again, this can be people, this can be curriculum, this can be space. It can also be things that we don't know. It can be things happening in their lives at home. It can be, illness of a grandparent. It can be a move. It can be moving from kindergarten to first grade. It can be a new teacher. So there's children's whole life is about change. They're going through so much physically and emotionally. There's so much physiological change that's happening. So they're living in this environment of change. And so we don't know what might be the trigger. But if we're engaging in a change process, we want to be on the lookout for some of these behaviors that may signal that this child is having a moment. I also want to just interject here. I did not specifically call out change with youth. And that was intentional because youth our adolescents are in such a liminal place. Sometimes they are able to respond responsibly and maturely to a change in their environment. Sometimes they revert and they respond as children. And so, that's something that you kind of have to, kind of figure out where they are on a case-by-case basis. So with children, and adults, experience these things as well. But for children, these are the things that we want to be watching for when we're engaging in change. So fear. There could be fear about changing a teacher or changing the people who are part of the program. They could manifest, kind of as anxiety about getting into a new classroom or having a new teacher. Certainly they can experience sadness. And, if there is a person who's leaving, remember, if you've had a religious educator for 8 to 10 years, that person has really grown with an entire generation of children. So the children may remember them from the time that they were in kindergarten and now they're in high school. And so the religious educator has been a significant adult in the life of these children. So there's going to be sadness. And there's going to be grief. And we'll talk a little bit about strategy for that, about sort of finding outlets and finding places for them to work that through. It could also manifest as anger. And so we've probably all experienced someone in our classrooms who's having some behavioral challenges that are manifesting as anger. And, those things, they can have many, many origins. But one of the origins can be about just sort of an inability to process a change quickly enough, or a sense of a feeling of resistance to change. I don't want things to change. And so they act out in anger. Sometimes our children will, the sadness will manifest as maybe isolating themselves. So there may be changes in how they engage in the classroom. And so we want to help our teachers to kind of have the eye for what's happening in the classroom. And again, this can happen with a change in people. It can happen with a change in place. It can, if you are renovating space and everybody's moving to a trailer or to a building down the street, children can be afraid of going to a new building or a new place because it's different. It's a change. They liked the pink cushion. They loved the mural on the wall. So we don't know exactly what might be the trigger, but there can be those kinds of responses from our folks. And with children, resistance is likely because they're testing, their lives are about change. Everything's changing for them all the time, but they may never have experienced this particular change. And so one form of resistance may be, well, why? Why is so-and-so going to leave? move, or why do I have to move to another classroom? And sometimes that could be a little bit of a hot button for an adult to try to help them. But that's part of a kind of a resistance pattern that they may be engaging in. We're not going to really pay attention to special needs, but I want to just sort of caution you that if there are special needs, and almost every program that we have today has a child with some kind of either a learning disability or a learning challenge or learning difference, whether it's something diagnosed or not. But sometimes there are those young folks in our congregation that need to have a little bit of special attention in any kind of a change situation. And that's something that you want to maybe talk with the parent about. You can, check out Sally Patton's book, Welcoming Children with Special Needs, or call me, call somebody, call a colleague or call me to talk that through a little bit and make sure that you're paying attention. You're mindful of folks who just may have a different kind of capacity to process and respond to change. So adults have, some of the same kinds of responses. We all have experienced change in a variety of places in our life, and sometimes we do have anxiety that comes from fear. Sometimes, fear can be about control, that we feel as though we don't have control of things around us anymore, and that can make us afraid. And that can also make us react with anger. It can lead to conflict. So these things are all interconnected. They're all related. So if we are engage in our covenantal conversations, we can sometimes stop these things before they become hurtful or before they gain some energy. So an adult may also want to return to what was. That's part of the roller coaster. What was wrong with the way we did it before? Why can't we keep doing it this way? Or that curriculum, I did it for 10 years. Why do we need to move to Tapestry of Faith? And so sometimes what happens is that if you open the door for folks who may want to kind of move to return to the status quo, that can set your change process back a little bit. So you want to be really careful about that. So one example, I know many congregations struggle around the Safe Congregations recommendations, the guidelines for two adults in a classroom. So if we start the year and we say, hey, we have this new Safe Congregations policy, 2 adults in every classroom. And then one Sunday comes along and, somebody doesn't show up and we only have 1 adult and we say, oh okay, go ahead. It's okay. Once you open that door, the tendency of people who have been resisting the change is to continue to push back. So you have to be really careful about opening that door. Some adults may lack focus, and they may, have a little difficulty kind of focusing in on what's really important. And I think sometimes we see this in religious education committee meetings, for example, where, or search process. We have a particular body of work that we have to do. We have tasks that we have to do related to the change, and they may disengage. They may not do their homework. They may show up late for a meeting. they may not be able to really focus in. They may want to shift the conversation to the fellowship event that's happening in 2 weeks, and kind of want to get into a little bit of denial. And adults may disrupt their self-care, may not be what it should be. So, for example, if we had a situation where a religious educator left in March, where we had the pipes burst and we had to move to a new space for a couple of months, a volunteer might say, I'm here for you, and I'm going to step in, and I'll be here every Sunday until the end of the program year, because I know this is a really critical situation. And then after 2 months, they're exhausted and they're ragged, and they're not doing the work in the way that it should be done. And so they're not taking care of themselves, and that can lead to burnout. So that can be a reaction to change. Sometimes communication can get a little icky during times of change because, there's new information. There's stuff that people want to know. Hey, what's happening? I haven't heard. Have they hired somebody? Are they interviewing? When's the new space going to be done? And those kinds of questions. And people, can sometimes get into bad habits around exchange of information during times of change, because information becomes a commodity during those kinds of times. And so folks, sometimes that can go south for us. So I encourage you to kind of stick with some really healthy communication patterns during times of change. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So one thing that's really important to know, particularly about children, is that they are very resilient. Children, again, their lives are really in constant motion, constant change happening to them. And it used to be that the research told us that this was kind of a personality characteristic. Either you were strong and resilient, or you weren't, or you were somewhere in between. But now the research is shifting a little bit, and it's beginning to tell us that it really can be learned, that resilience is a learned skill. And so our part of our work is to help our kids tap a natural tendency, perhaps, for resilience in the face of change, either through story, through ritual, through continued community opportunity, community gatherings. So we can help our young people really build their capacity for resilience. But the number one model for resilience in children is going to be their parent, their guardian, their caregiver, other important adults. So, congregation is an important place, and we get to know our kids very well, but there's also, 6 other days of the week where they are looking for models, teachers, extended family, whoever that might be. So the most important way that kids grow their capacity for resiliency is through adults modeling. During times of change, it's really important to kind of stabilize, to have those places where things do stay the same. So if you are moving to a different space, for example, you may want to take some of the old pieces, the old furniture, reset up the old bulletin board in the classroom, use the same chalice, have the same rug, those kinds of things where there's that moment of familiarity. There's that place of connection for them. Same thing with things like the program. So if you're undergoing some programmatic changes, the tendency is if you have an old curriculum you're bringing in a new curriculum. The tendency is to just, dive in, commit yourself wholly to the new curriculum. And generally that will work because most of the Unitarian Universalist curriculum that's out there actually follows a fairly predictable kind of pattern. Now, if you were to begin to do something completely different in the middle of a program year, then that might begin to feel uncomfortable for some of the kids. They might begin to resist. So you want to figure out, are there rituals like lighting the chalice? Are there rituals like having some kind of a listening circle that we can continue even if it's not a part of a new program, just to kind of bridge that time where they're learning something new. Kids are pretty adaptive though. So helping our children with change, the most important thing, whether it's a change in personnel, a change in place, space, or a change in how we do our work on Sunday morning, the most important thing is for them to know that they are loved, that this is still their faith community. So even if somebody won't be here anymore, that there are many people who love them, and this is a house of love. I think that's a message that can be in every classroom. It's a message that can be a part of the family worship time. If you have that family worship time in the beginning, it can be a part of a children's chapel, children's worship. Kids are smart and they want information too. Nobody likes to be surprised. So answer questions. If there's going to be a big change coming, nobody wants to show up on Sunday with one expectation and then have something be very different. So not always possible. We can't always, know what's happening, know what's coming. We can't always say that the pipes aren't going to burst and leak all over our classroom or there, some other unexpected thing might happen. But when we can, to give them, to communicate with them and to respect their ability to take the information in and to process it in a way that can help them, again, build that resilience. Letting them grieve is so important. Sometimes we don't want to give enough time to the grief process. And so we might say, well, the kind of the pat on the back and everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. And it probably will, but to make sure that we provide that space, that opening for them to feel what they feel and to express those feelings. And we're going to talk a little bit about some Tapestry of Faith resources in a couple of minutes. It's really important to plan some kind of a ritual or farewell event. So whatever's happening, if it's a change in space, we often do building dedications, but do a blessing of the old space before you leave it. Farewell events, of course, for staff, particularly longer term staff, they must be celebrated. We all must have those opportunities to say farewell and to shower them with our good wishes as they go. It's challenging if someone is leaving unexpectedly. That can be really challenging, and that in that case it can become kind of an after the fact. So rather than a farewell event, it's really more of providing that space for processing a loss. Because sometimes, if somebody, for example, if there were a termination of an employee, that's an adult issue. If someone has not been performing up to the expectations, and they're leaving suddenly. For kids, that's a little bit under their radar. So they've built relationship. They know this person. and so they're going to need to have an appropriate outlet for some of the sadness that they might feel. It's really important that we, through this process, that we keep a positive attitude as much as possible. The adults are sad sometimes, or the adults are stressed. I know, particularly when we're going through space shifts, we may be moving, maybe in a trailer, or people are just jammed into classrooms while something else is being renovated, or something new is being built. And, oftentimes it's the adults that sort of have that reaction, that the stress and the feeling of not really being not being able to be in control. So as much as we can, authentically to try to keep a positive attitude, that change happens, and this too, we will get through this, and there will be good and happy times on the other side. So thinking about adults, of course, many of these things can go both ways, adults and children. But one of the greatest barriers is their fear about the future. How am I gonna manage with kids in this space? How am I gonna get to know a new curriculum? This is all online, and I'm not really a computer person. How am I gonna make this work? So what are they afraid of? And provide them with an outlet for having those conversations. So it might be like a focus group for volunteers, or a focus group for parents, where or a listening circle rather, where you bring people together, 8 or 10 or 12 people, and let them ask questions, let them express, some of their concerns, and give them that place and that space to have those conversations. And that can alleviate so much anxiety, because, how it is when we start to think about things, and it's something that's kind of bothering us, and then it just starts to ramp up, and it really starts to take on a larger footprint than really it should, because we don't have that outlet. We don't have that opportunity to have somebody reassure us, or to have somebody, answer some factual questions about what next steps are, those kinds of things. So it's really important, if we can, to provide an opportunity for processing, because those are all normal responses for the most part. Again, with adults, acknowledge the grief, and really, if it's a long tenured staff person, or an adult, or a long-term volunteer, they're kind of like family. There's a real sense of connection there. We bring our hearts to church. We don't kind of make ourselves vulnerable in many other places in our lives. We don't come to our place of work and make ourselves vulnerable, usually in the same way that we might at church. And if we're parents, and if we're dealing with children, there's an added layer of sort of emotional investment, because we want our children we want things to be stable for our children. So so we have this concern for ourselves, and we have this concern for our children as well. If it's a person who was hired from the congregation and is now has retired, or is leaving, or going to another position, or even a volunteer, moving back to being a volunteer, that can be particularly painful, because we don't really know what our new relationship is going to look like. And there may be limitations, there may be boundaries on that relationship, that sort of the professional guidelines when somebody leaves a position, how they can engage with the congregation, is there's some very clear boundaries about that. They have to take some time away. And so those things can be really hard. I know I experienced that. I was a DRE in my own congregation for 9 years, and I've never really been able to re-engage there, despite the fact that it's been 9 years since I left. So that's can be a really significant piece. It's really important when we're helping adults during times of change, never to discount people's feelings. Never to, sort of say, don't, you'll get over it. Don't worry about it. People need to feel what they feel. And again, church, the congregation, the faith community is that place where they can have those feelings. Now, we are a covenanted community, so if those feelings start to get out of bounds or inappropriate, then there's a right relationship process for helping that person. And really, pastoral care may be needed for some folks during times of change. They really may need some one-on-one time where someone really helps them to express their feelings and helps to kind of bring their feelings to the light of day in a way that can help them see that things the roller coaster will swing back up. Another strategy that can be really important with adults is include them in the process. That's kind of a characteristic of our Generation X and even our millennials. They want to be they want to be on the team. They don't want to just show up and have somebody tell them what to do. They really want to be decision makers, and they want to have a say in what happens next. So this time, if you're, for example, going into an interim time, there's a tension because you want to maintain some stability, you want to maintain some routines and rituals, but it's also an opportunity to try different things, to experiment, to be creative, to think creatively about how we engage with the children, or how the space is configured, or any number of things about Sunday morning. And communication is really important. I mean, that's important in any aspect of our congregational life, but particularly when you are engaged in a change process of some kind. There obviously, if it's personnel, there are boundaries, there are limitations on what can be disclosed when. But as much as you can say and as often as you can communicate, that will help tamp down the anxiety in a way that will make people feel like, okay, really good people are in charge of the process, and they're moving forward, and I'm hearing good things, and things are going well. And so people are going to feel better about the process. So what's next? So I think I kind of already touched that. Leaders really need to convey and let people know that we have a good process here. If it's renovating space, we have a solid plan. We've thought about how we're going to move the furniture, and how we're gonna get the kids into a new space down the street. Or if it's a shift in staff, that we have folks who are really competent and really excited and see this work as a real opportunity to help the congregation move forward. If conflict arises, or I should say when conflict arises, because these are emotionally charged times. And particularly if it's a whale kind of event, where it's a really sort of a big splash, and people are feeling a little bit reactive, you want to really face conflict in healthy ways. Help to diffuse it. If you have somebody who's really resisting change and doesn't want to hear about it, doesn't want to talk about it. It may be that they have a trusted colleague or a trusted friend in the congregation where you can create kind of a healthy triangle you try to work with this person through someone that they trust. Or it may be that pastoral care is required from the ministry team, from the lay caring, whatever particular process you have in your congregation. If it's a really big change, if you're building a new building, if you have a long-term staff person leaving and you have an interim coming in for some period of time, leading to a new settled person, you might want to create an actual plan. It doesn't have to be. I'm not talking about 10 pages with appendices. I'm talking about 1 or 2 pages that says, hey, this is the rough outline of steps that we are going to take, and here's a timeline, and that timeline is subject to lots of things going wrong or going right, but to give people something as a starting place. That can really help, and also to help people understand what their role is in the change. What do I have to do to help this happen? If you have a program change, you're changing curriculum. Teachers who've been teaching with one particular program for a long time may have a lot of anxiety about starting something new. Hey, I knew what to do. I knew how this worked, and I don't know this new thing, and so I need to be trained, and I need to get comfortable with it. So, helping people, to maybe even have a written plan can be helpful. Again, you want to provide that pastoral care if it's needed, and encourage people to engage in self-care. Make sure that volunteers are getting Sundays off. If you're in rented space or space that is not your own, or space that's too small or doesn't have enough light or doesn't have air conditioning, that wears people down. And so you want to make sure that you have good rotation among volunteers, or that you provide some alternate activities so that the children don't become the benefactors of that weariness and that stress that can come. I talked about, if you change a policy, you got to stick with it because the system wants to move back. The system wants to move back where it was. And so people will, if the door is open, people will gladly walk through it. So I have a couple of resources that I want to share. There's a new set of web pages, and this is brandy new. This is like in the last week. I don't know if anybody is doing theme-based ministry, but they have just introduced theme-based ministry pages for RE. So this theme-based ministry is where you have a month-long theme, for example, and the theme maybe happiness, kindness, or it could be grief, it could be change. And so what they have introduced now is all of the Tapestry of Faith programs that are available online, all are now tagged by theme. So you can go on to uua.org, go to these pages, and you can type in, you can search by change. And what will come up is stories for working with children around change, activities for helping them work through change, group activities, take-home projects, social, connected sort of faith in action. So you can get you can structure some activities, maybe a children's chapel or some other maybe classroom activities that are really meant to deal with change or with grief or with loss, whatever the the particular thing is that you need. So this is a great resource if you are in that situation. Also on uua.org, which has been recently totally redone, by the way. If you haven't been on uua.org recently, they have, it's really gotten way more usable. So But there is a section on just general change and conflict skills for leaders. So, and actually, I mentioned this book before. My friend Gil Rendell. Gil was a speaker a number of years back at something called UU University that took place. It was leadership training that took place at several of our General Assemblies. And Gil did leading change. So he did a keynote based on his change work, and that's actually available as a YouTube video. It's that video in the upper right hand corner on that page. So these are just some general guidance around managing change as a leader for any situation, really. So it's 7:54. I said it would be about an hour. And now some questions. Do you guys have some questions, or are there any stories or successes that you've had that you'd like to share? And either type in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself, you can even turn your cam on if you are so inclined. Let's see what we have. So there's a question here from Ken. Can you talk about the proper method for disseminating information during the change process? Paid DRE that was leaving, which was an opportunity to change. And but we might need to move ahead. They have now withdrawn their resignation. Wow. Ken, we need to have a conversation. That is a very challenging situation that I have to say does not happen very often. And that really, what that creates for folks is just creates confusion. It creates confusion, and there's a real challenge there in how do we communicate this. I don't have an immediate answer for that. I need to sort of meditate on that for a moment, but I'd love to have a little conversation after the fact. So resources for parents. So resources for change. We do have, there are some, I think there is an on-demand webinar about change. Certainly this webinar will be available in the next couple of days for anyone to view. It's an open webinar. If you go on to Tapestry of Faith, there are stories and there are take-home activities for families to use during times of change, things that reflection questions and things like that might be helpful, that could be used as a take home, as a handout for families. How do you handle anxiety and conflict when you don't have a covenant? Well, so anxiety, there's always a little level of anxiety in a congregation. And, just having good meeting skills, good communication skills is one small step. The other thing is that if we don't have a written covenant that's, up on the wall and printed on the back of every order of service, we do have we have an implicit covenant with one another. And so we have, there are ways of behaving within a congregation, and we have our way of being is pretty much, sort of the 19th century Protestant sort of demeanor. We don't get too excited about things. We don't jump up and say amen every time. We sit quietly. We have a very particular style that happens communication wise in our congregations. That's based on DNA. That's quite old. But people, there's sort of an unwritten covenant there of behavior. It might be called civility. And when people are outside of that, if you don't have a covenant, it becomes an issue. It either becomes a pastoral issue. So, people need to inquire, how is it with you? What's happening with you? We're hearing you talk out, speak out, in uncomfortable ways about what's happening. So that can come either from the religious educator, if it's a parent, or if it's a volunteer. It can come from the minister. If you have a committee on ministry, that's really a great place for that conversation to take place, for someone to reach out to that person. Again, create a healthy triangle where a person that this person trusts is brought in to try to help them manage their responses and manage their discomfort, because they're trying to give their discomfort to other people. And we have another question here. Oh, Molly's saying that she went through a situation. I think she's maybe talking about the Ken's situation, and would be willing to share. Yeah. Are there any models of restorative justice being utilized in UU congregations to deal with conflict? There certainly are. I think that's a learning edge for many of our congregations. It's kind of terminology that is a little bit new. So there are I believe there are some tools on UUA.org. If you search for restorative justice, I think things will come up. I think most of those things are going to come up in sort of the multicultural witness and advocacy area. So, really, the material, the resources that we have tend to be restorative work in areas of racial justice, rather than sort of a broader kind of restorative justice. But there are that's relatively new. There are a few resources on UUA.org. Good question, though, Carol. I'm gonna look into that a little bit more. I appreciate that question. Okay, so did I miss any questions, or is there anything else? I see that Molly has clarified that yes, the resignation withdrawal, she has experience with that as well. So we'll have a conversation about that. So that's what I have for you, friends. Any other closing comments or any other questions for me? I appreciate your time. I appreciate that you have spent this hour with me and with 10 of our, actually 10 and more of your fellow Unitarian Universalists. This will be available within the next couple of days if you wish to share it further. And I'm always available for specific consultation in the area of faith development. You can find me, and I'm going to type here, so it might be loud, but I'm going to do it. You can find me, first name, last name, at UUA.org. Everybody, if you're in the Central East region, you also have a primary contact for your congregation. And if you're not sure who that is, you can check the website, or you can pop an email to me, and I'll be happy to help you out. So thank you all, and have a great night.